Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Sonia, thank you very much for inviting me. And Eve and George, thank you very much for being here, too. So what I'd like to do is talk about what my colleagues and I see as the underpinnings or partial underpinnings of support for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. But before I do that, let me step back and say something broad about the subfield of political psychology. And let me even step back beyond that to communicate kind of a generic formulation of social behavior that was advanced by the person considered to be the father of American social psychology. Does anybody have a sense who that is, who that person is? Sorry? Who?
Tocqueville, that was a joke.
Oh, Tocqueville. That's who it was. Well, yeah. In the sort of formal sense, we consider it to be a man named Kurt Levine, who was a professor of psychology at the University of Berlin, and then at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology. And if I had some chalk or a marker, I would write his formulation, but it's very simple. It's that social behavior equals a function of P and E. And P are the forces that emanate within a person. So we're all different in a number of ways. Maybe it's 5 different ways, the big 5. And E represents the forces that impinge on us from the environment. So situations or political contexts yield differences in our behavior. We might act one way in one context, but we might act a different way in another context. Now, the complicated thing about this is that they don't come as independent streams of forces. They interact with each other. Okay? Meaning that not everyone responds to the same situation in the same way. Or the situations that person A experiences lead to different behavior than the situations that person B experiences. And so we have to model human behavior and preference and choice and so on as a function both of the forces that emanate within people, the forces that emanate on people from their contexts or environments, and the ways in which people and environments interact. And we can then define political psychology in a very general way as taking those behaviors that are political, however we define that term, as a function of the same kinds of forces and the interaction between those two forces. And so I've done some work that over the past, I don't know, a decade and a half that's been guided by that generic proposition. That is, we have to think about individual differences, and we have to think about differences in the contexts that within which we live and their interactions. All right, so that's point number 1. I want to make one other point at the outset, and that is that there may be many ways in which people differ from one another. In a book that I published with 2 co-authors just this year, we took a variety of those differences that we think are all substantively pretty similar. They have different names. We can call them authoritarianism, openness, need for closure, dispositional risk aversion. We can give them different names. They have traditionally different ways that they're measured, but they have, at least in the subset of political preferences that we look at, which are economic preferences, they all have the same kinds of effects, so we call them open versus closed. We think that that's a good sort of superstructural label for those differences. Now, this is a talk in which the force emanating within individuals is referred to as authoritarianism. It's a name that some political scientists are ambivalent about. They don't think it's a great label, but they can't currently think of anything better. And so the label itself is not so important. In fact, it may even be a distraction. What's important is, what does it mean? And as I go through my presentation, I'll define it in a couple of different ways because it does have some different angularities. One of them is a difference in the need for order. So we think that all societies have the problem of trying to figure out how much freedom can we allow people to have, and how much social conformity do we think we need to demand. So we all think that at a traffic light, do you have traffic lights in France? You do? Okay. In Ireland, they don't have them. That's right. We all think at a red light, you have to stop, no matter who you are, no matter what your personal predilection is, you have to stop. Okay? So we demand at least that much conformity. Okay? Now, some of us think we should be largely conforming in a variety of other ways. Otherwise, the social order will collapse. Others of us think that we can allow individuals to have more freedom and individuality and autonomy, and the social order will probably not collapse. That it's okay that we might be different from each other, that we might look different, that we might have different ideas, and that we might behave differently. Okay? Now, those people who we regard as high in authoritarian, or who we call authoritarians, they tend to believe that society is oftentimes at risk of collapsing into chaos, and therefore we can't allow too much in the way of diversity of people, ideas, and behavior. Okay? If we are unified in what we think and how we look and what we do, that will protect the social order from collapse, which none of us want. People who are low in authoritarianism, as I say, are less worried about the imminent collapse of the social order, and therefore they allow or are tolerant of more individual variation in people, ideas, and behaviors. Okay, so this is a sense of what we mean when we use the term authoritarianism. Now, the last prefacing comment is that authoritarianism is, at least to a significant degree, genetic. Do you know what I mean by genetic? We inherit it. You know how you look like one of your parents? Well, the reason for that, right, is because our genetic makeup receives a contribution from each of our parents, and this is the same with behavioral traits. They vary in how heritable they are. Some behavioral traits tend to be very small with regard to the genetic component. Others are quite large. Authoritarianism and openness versus closedness more generally is quite strongly heritable. So these are deep-lying differences between people. Okay, that's all by way of preface. Do I have any more time? So I'll give the presentation now. All right. 3:17. Hang on. Stopwatch. Go. Okay. So now let me talk about part of the title. The second line here says Republican support for Donald Trump. We are studying the part of the American 2016 election that took place within each of the two political parties to decide who the nominee would be. So we are not looking at Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. We're looking at Donald Trump versus four other candidates: John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas, Marco Rubio, a senator from Florida, and Jeb Bush, who is the former governor of Florida. And the reason we're looking at the primaries is that in American presidential elections, more than 9 out of 10 people who call themselves Republicans will just vote for the Republican candidate. And same on the Democratic side. So there's really not that much more to explain in a general election. The real question, I think, is how did Donald Trump win the nomination? He ran against 16 other candidates, all but one, so 15 of the 16 had significant government experience. Donald Trump had none. Donald Trump also seemed to be proud of the fact that he really didn't know that much about politics. When asked, or when he was told that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, he said, "I didn't know that." He said, "I don't think most people know that." But the polls suggest that most people knew that. He didn't know it. All right, so the question then is, how did Donald Trump become the nominee? Here are some widely shared understandings of how Donald Trump won the campaign. So at the individual level, he was supported by people who were racially prejudiced. He was supported by people with anti-immigration sentiments, people who held what is now understood to be a white identity, those who can be described as populists, and those that had traditional gender role attitudes. At the demographic level, Donald Trump was unpopular among people who live in ethnically diverse places. He was popular among people with low levels of education, and arguably, and there's some controversy about this last piece, but that he was popular not among the poor, but in areas of economic downturn. And so the question at the bottom of the slide here is, how are individual level factors moderated by context? So we're taking these individual level factors, there we go, and we're trying to understand if their impact on support for Donald Trump was different depending on the context in which the person lived. All right, now I want to home in on this characteristic, this individual level characteristic of authoritarianism. Okay. So let me first ask you to consider some of the overall characteristics of Trump's campaign. He raised fear of terrorism and crime. He appealed to law and order. He appealed to ethnocentrism. He appealed to white identity. And he tried to characterize himself as a strong leader. In his major nomination speech in July, he said, "The country is in chaos and only I can save you." These are unusual things for American presidential candidates to say and to do. Okay, so the argument then generally is here that these are ingredients that should appeal particularly to people who have authoritarian predispositions, right? These are people who are intolerant of difference and diversity, who very much value the stability of the social order, and who are indirectly intolerant of major change, which the country is undergoing in various ways. Okay, let me apologize for the large number of words that appear on some of these slides. This is the fault of Stanley Feldman, okay? He's the one who made these slides, and I would have done a much better job. Okay? Otherwise, he's fantastic. Okay. So let me go through a subset of these words to talk a little bit more about authoritarianism. I want to call your attention to this middle part of the slide. It says, theory and research show that the political impact of authoritarianism is conditioned, where did it go? Conditioned by social threat. I think it's dying. Oh well. Well, we'll see. But the idea, again, is from the beginning of what I said or at the outset, that forces at the individual level often combine with forces in the environment. So there is really no one-to-one correspondence between authoritarianism and political behavior. In some cases, authoritarianism is expected to make no impact on political behavior at all. Okay? And those situations in which authoritarianism is irrelevant are those in which the environment is perceived as non-threatening. Okay? Authoritarians are not always acting in an authoritarian way, by which I mean a way in which their preferences are intended to reduce variation in ideas, people, and behavior, or to create social cohesion. Okay? That motivation is activated among authoritarians in the context of the presence of social threat. Okay? And the idea that we have here at the bottom is that we expect that the effect of authoritarianism in support for Donald Trump will be highest in areas where people are exposed to the most diversity. So diversity is a kind of threat that is very threatening to authoritarians. It's not threatening per se, it's not threatening in some a priori or logical sense, but it threatens the particular kind of person who is generally on the lookout for the idea of too much diversity and worries about the idea of diversity. So, all right, let me talk about the context of social threat. The two bolded parts of the slide depict two different kinds of threat. One is arguably the kind that was most relevant to the election, national threat. Right? So Trump may have leveraged these national threats that related to immigration, terrorism, and crime. Okay? The latter two, terrorism and crime, were were occurring at a higher rate in 2016. So it could be characterized as a generically, nationally threatening context. In this formulation, everyone in the country would be relatively similarly exposed to a constant or identical level of threat. However, threat might also be conceptualized at the local level. And that's helpful to us because this allows us to take one election and define threat at different levels for different people. So it's methodologically nice, but it also comes from the idea, the last line here. It's interesting to determine how people's immediate environments might affect them. But largely it gives us leverage, right, to look at different levels of threat depending on where people live. Okay, so what sort of diversity is most threatening to authoritarians? Well, it could be that local, racial, or ethnic diversity is threatening. I published a paper just this year showing that authoritarians tend to act more like authoritarians, right, to insist more on social cohesion when they live among ethnic and racial minorities. So we look at that. But the one that we're really interested in here is the second one that we call cultural or normative threat. And the idea here is that the kinds of things that are here, gay rights, gay marriage, secular challenges to religion, non-traditional gender roles, or gender competition even, can all be understood as creating diversity of ideas, people, and behavior, where people are acting more or less in autonomous ways and are not being constrained by a strong norm of homogeneity. Okay? We think that authoritarians who live in places that are more culturally diverse or liberal, that connection, high authoritarianism times living in a culturally threatening environment, might be the key to understanding why someone votes for Donald Trump in the primaries over other more establishment figures. Okay, so here we are going to focus on the primaries. Ignore this slide, it's not really important. Okay, let me say this about this slide, a limitation to Trump's authoritarian appeal. There's no theoretical reason to believe that authoritarian women would be any less attracted to Donald Trump than authoritarian men. We haven't seen anything in the literature to suggest that any of this is gendered. But in this study, you'll see it's extremely gendered. Women just do not follow the theoretical pattern. Now, did you notice that Donald Trump made statements or engaged in behaviors relevant to gender that were a little different than most candidates? Between the second debate and the third debate, there was a tape that came out, if you remember this, where he bragged about assaulting women. This, again, is unusual. And then bragged about it afterward. So, we were all just raising big question marks as to how any of this was possible. All right, so let me now describe the data that we used. These are data that came from a panel study, which is a study in which we measured people over time. We measured them 4 times. We had about 3,500 people, but we had 846 respondents who identified as Republican and who voted in the Republican primary. So we're going to look at them, and we're going to also look at where they lived, and we're going to construct a variable at the county level, in fact, several of these variables, to try and estimate the level of environmental threat in a given county. Okay. Now, first let me talk about how we measure authoritarianism. This is pretty important. It's measured, for better or worse, by 4 items that are pairs of child-rearing values. So we come back to the child in the room and ask the father, which would you like your 8-month-old daughter to have? Would you like her to be independent, or would you like her to respect elders? Would you like her to be obedient? It's a girl, right? Okay. Would you like her to be obedient or self-reliant? Would you like her to be considerate or to be well-behaved? Would you like her to be curious? Well, there goes the curious. Or would you like her to have good manners? Okay, what's important about these is that they force people to make a choice between pairs of desirable qualities. And they are meant to capture different kinds of decision-making. Right? An autonomous, freedom-oriented, individualistic approach to life versus one that is geared more to social conformity. So if you respect elders, if you're obedient, well-behaved, and, well, not if you are those things, if you prefer that children have these traits, respect for elders, obedience, well-behaved, and good manners, then you're characterized as high in authoritarianism. If, rather, you value independence, self-reliance, being considerate, and being curious, then you are low in authoritarianism, and there's a distribution, right? You can pick 2 low authoritarian traits, 2 high authoritarian traits, 3 versus 1, 1 versus 3, or all 4 in one way or the other. This measure, again, for better or worse, has been the standard way of measuring authoritarianism in political science, and it's been carried in national surveys for about 25 years. Now, the last thing to say about this is that it is not a measure of political preferences. It's meant to be pre-political and apolitical. Okay? It's meant to be psychological. And it has no overt political content, or at least not too much. Okay, now I want to get to our main measure of how counties differ from one another. We took 6 indicators. A county is, what would be, do you all know what an American county is? Is Ile-de-France, is that a county?
No, it's a state.
It's a state?
It's supposed to be a state.
All right, is there something? A commune? Counties vary in their size, but these are just geographical designations. Some counties have 600,000 people, some have 50,000 people. Commune? Communité? No, commune. Okay, whatever. Now, oops. Counties vary in terms of the percent of people who completed college. They vary in terms of whether they are married or single. They vary in terms of the percentage of people who live in a county who work in 2 kinds of occupations, informational and financial. They vary in terms of the number of evangelical congregations, and so these are, you might know them as fundamentalist Protestant churches. And last but not least, this will not make any sense in France because smoking is not class-linked, I gather here, but in America it is. And so we measure the percent of people in the county who smoke cigarettes. Okay? Now, if you look at all of these factors at the county level, okay, they all go together. So these are the what are called factor loadings. Right? So the more people who graduated from college, the less likely the people in the county are to be married, the more they're likely to work in these 2 types of jobs. The fewer of these kinds of churches are in the county, and the fewer number of smokers. Okay, so anyone who's familiar with data sort of, reduction techniques, we can see that the variables that I mentioned, those 6 variables, are really loading on one factor. They can be explained by one general factor that we call cultural liberalism. Okay? Now, this is a moment in which I'm offering a prize. This is the distribution of counties in America. The question I have for the prize is, which county is that? Anybody?
Sausalito or
Not you. Forget what he said. What? Not Boston. What part of the country? East, middle, or west? West. What's the name of the county? California. It's in California. Where in California? San Francisco. Okay, so San Francisco has the most college graduates and the fewest smokers. Okay? What's that? Oh yeah, it could be Washington. I was just guessing. So I'll accept that as an answer. That's very good. It's either one of the 2. Good job. You're probably right. The opposite side? Oh, what is that? I can't work this thing. What is that? My guess is that somewhere in Kentucky. Eastern Kentucky. Okay, so this is the distribution of cultural liberalism at the county level. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to go to this. Okay, so are there any Trump supporters in these very liberal counties? Yes, there are. Okay, so this is the estimated percentage of Trump supporters within the Republican identifiers. So there are plenty of Trump supporters even in these liberal places. Okay, all right. I'm going to skip all this. And I'm going to go to this. Now, this is going to take a moment to explain. This is how political scientists depict interactions. And the y-axis is a coefficient. It's the influence of authoritarianism on support for Donald Trump. Now, the idea of this line is that the coefficient, right, the relationship between support for Trump and authoritarianism varies across the level of cultural liberalism at the county. So in conservative counties, up to right there, there is no influence of authoritarianism on support for Donald Trump in the primaries. So high authoritarians living in those counties were equally likely to support any of the other candidates. Okay? The impact of authoritarianism becomes stronger and most strong in the most culturally liberal counties. So what's happening is that high authoritarians who are living in environments that we would understand to be threatening to them are reacting to that threat by moving their support to the candidate who promises to clamp down, right? To restrict the freedom of people so as to, in their view, in the view of high authoritarians, stabilize the social order. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is my main finding. That is, the impact of authoritarianism on support for Donald Trump is variable. It occurs in culturally liberal places, but nowhere else. This is the same thing when you look at how people feel toward the candidates. It's just changing, rather than voting for the candidate, it's how you feel. So it's just another way of measuring it. Now I come to this atheoretical problem of gender. So we look at the effect now that we just did, the impact of authoritarianism on support for Donald Trump by county liberalism for men separately than women. And what we find is that the whole effect that I showed you before is carried by men. Men are in the solid line. All right, so high authoritarian men become disproportionately likely to vote for Donald Trump in liberal counties. Women are on the dotted line. There is no effect of authoritarianism on voting for Donald Trump among women at any level of county liberalism. How much time do I have?
I think you should
Stop? Okay. All right. I'm just about done. So it raises the question of sexism and Donald Trump's behavior. And I'm going to skip this. And I want to go just to this last slide. Now, you might think, well, authoritarianism performs the way it does because that's how lots of other variables perform. That is, their political impact depends on or interacts with something in the environment. These are other variables that had strong effects in the election, but were not variable or conditioned by county level liberalism or ethnic or racial diversity at the county level. And so the last point that I want to make here is that authoritarianism seems to be, or its political effects seem to be sensitive and dependent on threat in the environment, whereas the impact of other kinds of attitudes or beliefs or dispositions don't seem to be so. Okay? So the dynamic here is one that combines a force emanating within people with one that is emanating in their local environments. They combine to produce political behavior. And I'll just finish it by concluding then that Donald Trump probably won the nomination, at least in part, on the basis of voters who were highly authoritarian, but who lived in environments in which they were encountering levels of diversity of ideas, people, and behavior that was too much for them to bear. And they viewed Donald Trump's authoritarian candidacy as a way to reduce that diversity. Merci. Sorry? Oh, I will. I just turned it off for a second. Yeah.
Okay, we can take questions from the floor.
I'm good. Well, I talked for 5 minutes before that, so this is perfect. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have
Simon, you're too far.
Simon, then maybe the second one. But
Sure.
the first question is relates to how you composed your cultural liberalism index
Yes.
for counties.
Sure.
Is that the slide where you had the number of cigarettes that were smoking? Or is that the correlations?
It is the common, I mean, in non-technical language, it's the common variance. I should have not, here. I'm going to show you what, just, I'll put this back for a second. Oh, it's in French, isn't it? Hang on.
What are the variables that compose this? Third one.
I'll tell you what, why doesn't somebody come up and do this for me? Because it'll take me longer than 5 seconds. So there are 6 variables at the county level. And they are all strongly intercorrelated. They are the percentage of people with university degrees in the county, the percent of people who are not married, adults who are not married in the county, the percentage of people, okay, the third and fourth, the percentage of people who work in 2 kinds of occupations. Informational, like people who work for, say, Google or Apple, and those who work in finance, like Wall Street. And then the number of evangelical churches or congregations, that loads negatively. It's negatively correlated with those others. And the percentage of people who smoke, which is also negatively correlated with the first 4. Now, when we put those 4 together, they're all strongly intercorrelated. And what we did is we generated a latent factor from those 6. Sure.
If I may follow up with that, one methodological concern will be that it may well be that you have more counties than respondents. And how do you deal with the fact that there is a discrepancy between the number of counties? There are more than 300 counties in the US, and you have less than 100 respondents.
3,000 counties. Well, what we do, we don't have that many because we only have 846 respondents, and so it's fewer counties. But we're not looking at individual counties, we're looking at the latent scores. And so it doesn't really matter how much, how densely populated, each latent, latent value is. I mean, we have enough, so that we could say, look at the impact of authoritarianism if we divided county liberalism in half, show that it's related, or show that the effect of authoritarianism on politics or on voting for Donald Trump is strong in the culturally liberal counties, taken as a whole, but that there's no effect of authoritarianism in the culturally conservative counties. So we could just divide it in the middle if we felt like it was too sparse to model as a continuous variable. Yes, please.
Yes, a quick glance at the results of the election, not the primaries, but the election itself, show that there are a number of counties, or at least states, in which people are white, they are very conservative, they are religious, and they've seen very few Hispanics, and sometimes very few blacks, and they are very authoritarian, and they go to Trump. And you should know that in France, for example, for a long period of time, those who voted for the radical right were not those who were the most exposed to immigration, poverty, and diversity,
Yeah.
living in an area or zone or a district in which there was such diversity. But they were neighboring a place where people were experiencing this diversity, and they were anticipating that it would be worse in the future. So it was not about a spatial difference, it was about a temporal difference. It will be worse in the future if there will be no Trump or no Le Pen or no whoever.
Yeah, that's a great question. It raises three things. One of them is that in the first kind of, I'm just going to wait until you're, yeah. In the first kind of county that you talked about, religious, rural, very conservative, those places were especially likely in the general election to vote for Donald Trump, but not because of authoritarianism at the individual level. In those places, there was no impact of authoritarianism. They were voting Trump, but for other reasons. And so there's a distinction between authoritarianism-based voting and then voting that occurred in those places for other reasons. The last thing, right, is that there was this sense all right, so going along with the idea of rural people voting for Trump is that there are fewer religious minorities, fewer racial minorities, but they anticipated, if they were living close to more diverse places, right, that they would soon be living, you know, in those kinds of environments. And at least from the preliminary data, as you point out, they were you know, disproportionately likely to vote for Trump as well. So proximity to diversity also seems to be driving support for Trump in the election, right? Which, again, makes sense for the same kinds of reasons that we've been discussing, yeah. But thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks a lot. I have two questions about your
Please.
measures.
Sure.
So the first is about, again, cultural liberalism. And my question was about your indicators. For me, it could mean two things.
Okay.
It could be a measure of social diversity, as you mean it is.
Oh, the county level variable.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry.
County level, yes.
This one.
And it can also be a measure of the fact that authoritarians are in minority in this kind of countries, and it's another way, another mechanism that could explain the activation of authoritarian disposition, and it could work in the other sense for left-wing voters. If they are in minority, they could be more radicalized. So it's
Okay.
another mechanism on how
Okay.
to
Yeah. Okay.
And the second,
Yeah.
after-
Oh, okay. Let me answer that one real quickly, and then you get to the second one. So that's a great question. And when you construct any kind of variable at the individual level or at the aggregate level, there are always threats to causal inference, because it could be that some unmeasured variable at the county level, which is different than the one we described, is carrying the effect, right? So one possibility is that it's, you know, the kinds of local, racial, and ethnic diversity. So we have a measure of that at the county level as well. I should have mentioned that. And we have a couple of other measures too, but we have one of racial and ethnic diversity. Now, when you take out the cultural liberalism factor, it looks like the interaction is between authoritarianism and levels of local ethno-racial diversity. When you put the cultural liberalism factor in, it wipes out the effect of ethno-racial diversity, but the effect of cultural liberalism remains. That wasn't hypothesized, that's just the way it turned out. But we found that really interesting. Go ahead.
Thanks. And the second question was about your measure of authoritarianism.
Okay.
Because, I read some research that used the same kind of measure, and it has some very low reliability, like in Stenner work. So
Sure,
my
sure.
question was about how to deal with that, how to interpret results when your basic construct has low reliability.
Okay. Well, I don't think it's unacceptably low. It's about in the 0.6 to 0.7 range, so it's not too low. But low-ish reliability can be good. Hear me out.
Correct for attenuation.
No, we don't do that. But if you have a reliability of 0.95, you're basically asking the same question, right? And so you're getting at a narrower slice of the theoretical idea that you're trying to measure. And so somewhat lower reliability, one could make the argument that reliability in the 0.7 range is better because you're getting at somewhat non-overlapping aspects of the theoretical idea. Yeah.
Can I give a different answer to that?
Sure.
Reliability is a function of the scale property you have. Dichotomous variables always understate the true correlation. So by presenting it as a dichotomous alternative choices rather than how strongly do you agree or disagree with that, would you put yourself in the middle between independence and respect for elders, close to one, close to the other, you would improve it. Plus you only have 4 items. So the fact that you get a reliability as high as you're getting with items constructed in that fashion is actually a measure of the goodness of those items, not their weakness.
And let me say one more thing, and that is that we don't really know what these 4 items measure. We don't know what the word should be. What we do know is that compared to lots of other ways of capturing some force emanating at the individual level, for whatever reason that we don't know, these 4 dichotomous choices are politically really powerful. And I don't think it's necessary to refer to this as authoritarianism. Some people have stopped doing that, and they refer to it as worldview, cultural worldview. So Mark Hetherington is a political scientist now at the University of North Carolina in the United States, and he wrote a book in 2009 called Authoritarianism and Polarization. At the outset of the book, he said, look, I don't think this is a good label. I couldn't come up with anything better. He's got a new book, and he says, I came up with something better. I'm no longer going to call it authoritarianism. I'm going to call it cultural worldview. In the end, it's those 4 items.
Okay, 3 more questions, beginning with Valentin.
So thank you so much for your interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a more prospective question about in a relationship with the results you highlight. You showed that it's not the authoritarianism in itself which boasts the votes, the Republican support for Trump, but the liberal environment which boosted it. Could we put the hypothesis that the Trump's election is more an example of is not really a manifestation of an increasing conservative America, but an indirect index of a more progressist America, because we could put the hypothesis that in light with your results that this phenomenon is not a manifestation of an increasing conservatism within the US, but of a radicalization of people among a more progressive environment. I'm thinking about results showed by the Pew Research Center, which highlighted that American population is more and more identifies itself as Democrats, as progressives, etc. So, do you mean that in a way, Trump election could be considered as an indirect index of a decline of the American conservative right?
Wow, that is another just fantastic question. Let me say first, Donald Trump is not racist. I'm just kidding. But your question, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you should have the microphone because I might get this wrong, is that the election of Donald Trump is somehow paradoxically suggesting the decline of American conservatism. Is that right? I think that's right. Or at least it's right in the following way, that the the nature of conservatism as defined by the Republican Party, right? The way that it's defined by elites who then implement what they refer to as, or what they assume to be conservative policies, is not what the majority of Republican voters want. This is, this gets to the core of this historically reoccurring dynamic in American politics. You've got a group of people who used to be Democrats, big D Democrats. They vote for the Democratic Party. Right? They were economically liberal. They preferred economic redistribution. They prefer the government, right, to intercede in the economy. And they were also socially conservative. So as the parties have updated over the past 40 years, there is no political party that represents people with that combination of opinions. And that is a systemic problem because the proportion of people with that combination is large. And so it's an oddity of the American political system that we have two political parties and neither successfully represent this large plurality of voters who are economically liberal and culturally conservative. And the demand for a candidate like Donald Trump has probably existed for quite some time. But the supply of a candidate like Donald Trump was not in evidence in either party going back decades. Right? So on the Republican side, Mitt Romney, if you remember him, and John McCain, and George W. Bush, and going back, were not candidates who this plurality of populists felt represented them. Trump came along, and the day that he announced his candidacy, he was the #1 candidate, and he never lost that lead. And I think in part, it's because the nature of conservatism is not one that is recognizable to the conservative political establishment. It's populist. And finally, the supply of populism at the elite level came in the person of Donald Trump. And we should be lucky that we have Donald Trump, and I don't mean this as a joke. We should be lucky we have him because he is a disorganized, disordered person who is very strongly disconnected from policymaking. Okay? If we had a much better Donald Trump, we would have something closer to Adolf Hitler. But Donald Trump is probably not someone who is going to be strategically capable, at least on the margin, of enacting the policies that he ran on, for which we should be grateful. Didn't mean that to be funny.
Hi. Over here.
Oh, hi.
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 My question is, you spoke about the threat in the environment, like the environmental threat. Could there not also be like a personal threat embodied by the incumbent president, perhaps, and his policies that he carried out that were, well, in terms of identity and also in terms of politics and the cultural and normative threats that his strides brought, perhaps, for those?
Yes. Yes, very much so. So in the wake of Obama's election, the inkling of what was to come 8 years later was already present in February of 2009, embodied by what label? The Tea Party. Do you remember what this Tea Party idea was? Well, the people who study the Tea Party argue that Donald Trump supporters and Tea Partiers are the same people. And so one way to look at the incumbent Barack Obama is someone who was not just African American. That's what tends to be the focus. And it's not to say that that wasn't important. It was. But Barack Obama represented something broader, and not just a cultural other, but he represented the embodiment of what we refer to as the meritocratic establishment, which populists feel excluded from. So when we had the Protestant establishment, women and Catholics and blacks and Jews and so on felt excluded. That gave way to a new political order that we refer to as the meritocratic establishment. Okay? And the group that feels excluded from that are those who make up Donald Trump's constituency as embodied by the Tea Party in the wake of Obama's presidency. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, 2 or maybe 3 questions to finish with. Christophe?
Thank you for your presentation. Just a small, short question about your modeling strategy. I didn't quite understand why you didn't control for economic variables at the macro level, at the county level. So can you please answer that? And did you use a standard ordinary least square regression or a multi-level regression?
It was a logistic regression. So we put all the other candidates who were Bush, Kasich, Rubio, and Cruz into one. There wasn't enough to do it as, say, a multinomial logit. Okay. And the first question, I do think, I was trying to get through some of this pretty quickly. Hang on, we did.
Because you measure a very
okay.
very tiny effect. In fact.
So, oh no, the effect is enormous. And our effect is enormous at high levels of cultural liberalism. But
at a very high level, but for most of the people.
Well, up until, right, but that's what we're predicting, right? That there's no effect of authoritarianism on support for Trump until you reach a certain level of cultural liberalism. But let me address the first part. We did include a measure of county median income. And we also have 2 measures of whether people resided in urban or rural counties. And we measured 5 additional variables at the county level. I'm sorry that I rushed or just chose to exclude that in my effort to get through the data. But the county, the county level economic variable had no effect. Rural, urban, no effect, at least in moderating the impact of authoritarianism. The measure of ethnic or ethno-racial diversity did, as I say, but not when you force it to compete with the county level cultural liberalism variable. Does that, yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you.
Fingers popped up, so nothing stops Trump, obviously. 2 questions to finish and final.
Okay, great. It would be just a quick question. Just to connect dot between Paul's comment and Eve's presentation forward. I'm just wondering about the mediating effect of emotion. Because when you speak about social tweet, it just can create some emotion between groups, like envy, guilt, fear, even fear. And then I'm just wondering if you add in this model the emotional measure and try to test moderating, mediating role of these two variables. And I think that would be great research there. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to deny that anger and fear, particularly anger, was irrelevant to the election. And I guess there are 2 ways to think about that. Right? One is to measure what we expect its antecedents are, so we can ignore it because we're measuring what we think causes it. Or we can expect, and I believe this is true, that it has some independent force in itself. And I suppose the question then is it a mediator? Is it a moderator? How do you incorporate it into a model? And I can see doing it in either way, but I'll just suggest the mediator approach to say that, if you are high in authoritarianism and you live in a culturally liberal county, I can imagine that the emotional output of that is one of strong anger or one of anxiety. Now, to take George's theoretical orientation, authoritarians who were living in culturally liberal counties, if they experience anxiety, they might be looking around at the various candidates within the Republican Party and saying, wait, this Trump fellow is the one, after careful consideration, is the one who is likely, right, to meet the demands of my anger or fear. And that, I think, is a different characterization of the nature of Trump support, which we sort of regard as mindless, gut level response. But it could be that authoritarianism, when activated in liberal environments, right, is associated with anxiety, right, which, according to George and his colleagues, would yield a very different a kind of process that would underlie support for Donald Trump, one that we might regard as more rational for those people in those situations. These are really great questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I've learned a lot in
Oh, thank you.
minutes.
Oh, thank you.
Not questions, but two remarks.
Sure.
I worked a lot with American colleagues, and I was wondering if the outcome of the elections in the US was not, let's say, a vote against the establishment and against Hillary Clinton, because she's, if I understood correctly, and living in New York City for a while, that she's hated by the people from the countries that you have mentioned.
Sure.
And my second question or remark is that I don't know if you know the French society, but don't you see any similarities with the French society and what is happening now with a president who is so-called Jupiter, and then a so-called opponent with, let's say, with some characteristic of being authoritarian?
Thanks. Regarding your first question, I think there are two aspects that one might bring out. One is that we thought the election was about Donald Trump. But elections are often about a combination of objects. And usually the incumbent administration, right, is a strong object in generating the choice. Hillary Clinton was not the incumbent, but she was in two indirect respects. Right? One, she was the wife of a former president, but more perhaps relevantly and recently, she was the Secretary of State and the same party, is a member of the same party as the current administration. Now, in American politics, you generally don't ever get to govern for 3 terms. So political scientists were saying a year out, well, our model tells us that Trump is going to win. And then those political scientists who would leave it at that said, I don't believe my model, because they didn't think Trump could win. But okay, he didn't. But in the end, he did. A second possibility, let me raise the second question is about the correspondence between France and America. Is that right? Okay. From what I can gather, similarities are unmistakable. Now, I don't know as much about French politics as I would need to try and address it, but it looks like the same kinds of people, in terms of being economically pro-welfare state and anti-immigrant and more generally intolerant and socially conservative, were the basis of support for Marine Le Pen. And by the way, Marine Le Pen was identified in Trump Tower sometime before the French election. And so, I don't have a nuanced response other than to say it looks very much like two highly similar cases. And of course, Trump supported Marine Le Pen explicitly, or at least implicitly. Yeah. Thank you.
So I have the pleasure to ask the last question, but indeed, I think these are 3 questions. But thank you very much for your presentation, but I'm not so sure whether I got it all right. So I would like to tell you how I understood and just let you correct me. So these are analyses on the primaries and not on the general election. Okay, so that I think is already something which is very important to understand in this regard. And I mean, looking at your evidence, you may think that authoritarianism only plays out in culturally diverse or liberal counties. But on the other hand, maybe one may, and if I'm not correct, please correct me, but it does not mean that authoritarians wouldn't vote for Trump in less culturally liberal environments, meaning that the personality trait only comes into effect when the environment is so diverse or liberal And in counties that are already authoritarian in a sense, because I equate it a little bit like an authoritarian environment on the other hand of the scale, it means that the impact of the environment is already so strong that you can vote for Trump,
yes,
even if you are only a little bit authoritarian. So
yes,
I think
yes,
it is important
in the general,
that we do not think that he was only voted for by authoritarians in culturally liberal counties, but also in counties that were less liberal culturally wise, but where the personality as such was not as important. So the personality was not triggered by the environment because the environment
exactly,
as such was already, well, conducive.
I think that's absolutely correct. And you can see that here, right? So the Trump did better in culturally conservative counties than he did in culturally liberal counties.
But exactly. So because that's really something that I wanted to get straight for me, because that could be kind of
this is general election.
Misunderstanding, but that means that where the diversity, the cultural diversity is there, this is where the personality trait is being triggered, right?
Exactly right.
But even for people who are less authoritarian, then they can have a tendency to vote for Trump if they are living in counties that are highly evangelical,
right? Yeah.
Or with many smokers.
And they certainly did. I mean, they, even more so than in culturally diverse counties, but for reasons other than authoritarianism.
So I think this is very, very important to,
to
kind of understand.
Right.
Okay, so
right.
meaning that the personality, the trait is really being strong only when the environment is very diverse.
Right.
But then that leads me to my second question, and this is the contact hypothesis. So even for guys who have these kinds of attitudes, feeling more easily threatened and having a stronger affiliation to social order and so on. But the contact hypothesis would tell us that these kinds of attitudes are being weakened in more diverse settings. So that would be another question. How would you answer to that? And then my last question, of course,
that's a good question,
is concerned with women. So apparently for women, the environment doesn't make a difference at all. It means that once they show authoritarian attitudes, they are going for vote for Trump, no matter where they live. That's what I got from you, right?
Yeah.
So they are apparently less influenced by the environment they are living in?
We don't know whether it's because Donald Trump is the object that we're modeling or for some other reason, but there is no this is regarding the gender effect. We don't know why it's happening, but here's our supposition. So the last candidate to look like Donald Trump in American politics was a man named Pat Buchanan, who ran in the Republican primaries against George Bush in 1992 and 96, but we're focusing on 92. Now, he was included in the national election study, the American National Election Study survey in that year. And so what we planned to do, I wish that we had done this before I came here, was to model the vote for Pat Buchanan, who was really very similar to Trump, and look to see whether the gender effect occurs. And our expectation is that it doesn't. And it doesn't because he did not make comments, over the course of his life that were seen as denigrating and demeaning to women. So that's our expectation, is that it was Trump. It's not the theory, it's that the object created a more complex effect so that women simply were not, they were somehow immune to it. There's no theoretical reason to believe that women and men act differently at the same level of authoritarianism and the same level of county liberalism. We can only suppose it had to be Trump, but we don't know. But if we analyze Buchanan and find no gender effect, then that will at least bolster our confidence a little bit that it was Trump. Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's good to focus on that because it's strange. Oh, right. So the contact hypothesis would say that when people encounter the other, those people who are different from them, that at least under a certain set of circumstances, they will become more tolerant. Okay. A number of circumstances have to be met for that to be true, but ignoring all of those conditionalities, it might be that the contact hypothesis is less powerful than the social threat hypothesis among authoritarians. So when you encounter in your personal life the other, right, you could either become more intolerant because you experience that contact as threat, or you could become more tolerant because you realize that different doesn't necessarily mean bad or wrong. Another possibility is that there was no contact between high authoritarians and those who, populate the cultural liberals who populate the environment. They could be segregated from them, right? So they're not encountering them, right, as individuals. They're experiencing them, in a more impersonal way, and that perhaps translates more to threat than to, pro-social contact. Another great question. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it.